Imagine serving your country overseas, putting your life on the line, only come home and discover your land, the very soil you fought to protect, was sold out from under you by a greedy homeowners association. That's exactly what happened to me. While I was deployed, risking everything in a hostile zone, the HOA back home saw an opportunity. They claimed I had abandoned my property, auctioned it off, and pocketed the profit. But what they didn't realize was that I had two powerful weapons they couldn't match: the law and the U.S. military. When I landed stateside, I went straight to the county office. Paper trails don't lie. The so-called sale was riddled with fraud, fake notices, and illegal filings. The HOA thought they were untouchable because they had money, lawyers, and control over the neighborhood. What they didn't count on was my training, my discipline, and my brothers and sisters in arms. I didn't just sue them. I invoked a federal act protecting deployed service members from exactly this kind of predatory nonsense. And when the judge saw the evidence, the ruling was swift. The sale was void. But that was just the beginning. The HOA had overstepped so badly that the court granted me something almost unheard of: authority to repossess not just my land, but the entire subdivision built illegally on it. Picture this: an entire board of smug HOA bullies watching in horror as U.S. Marshals, backed by a military legal team, served them with eviction notices. The very houses they lorded over were no longer theirs. I didn't just win my land back. I reclaimed every brick, every sidewalk, every pool they thought they owned. That day, the HOA learned a lesson they'll never forget. When you steal from a soldier, you don't just face a man, you face an army. I was halfway across the world, deep in the heart of a combat zone, when the betrayal struck. Life overseas was a cocktail of adrenaline and discipline. Every day was the same rhythm: boots crunching against gravel under the desert sun, the metallic scent of oil and gunpowder, the constant awareness that a wrong move could be your last. Out there, the only things that mattered were survival, trust, and the mission. Home felt like a memory locked in another lifetime. My connection to it was reduced to letters that arrived weeks late, photographs folded into creases from travel, and the thought of the land my father left me. The one steady thing in a world of chaos. That land wasn't just acres of dirt. It was a promise. My father had worked it with his bare hands, sweating under the same sun that burned my face overseas. Before he passed, he told me, "Son, this land is your anchor. When the world feels like it's spinning out of control, this will always be yours." I carried those words with me through every mission, every sleepless night, every time mortar fire lit up the horizon. But while I was out there giving everything I had for my country, the very thing I was protecting was stolen from me. The Homeowners Association, those self-appointed tyrants in polo shirts and clipboards, filed paperwork claiming I had abandoned my property. They knew I was deployed. My military status wasn't secret. But that didn't stop them. They forged notices, manipulated deadlines, and made it look as if I had turned my back on the land. Then, without hesitation or shame, they sold it off. I had no voice, no warning, no chance to defend myself. By the time I was granted leave and boarded a flight back home, the deed was done. The first moment I drove down the familiar road, my heart nearly stopped. Where my open land once stretched, dotted with trees and the outline of my father's old workshop, rows of cookie-cutter houses stood lined up like soldiers of concrete. Vinyl siding, manicured lawns, and freshly painted mailboxes, all erected on top of my soil. My backyard was now their driveways. My inheritance was their subdivision. And there, standing on one of those porches, I saw them, the HOA board members, the ones who had orchestrated this theft. They were sipping coffee, waving to each other with smug smiles, like kings surveying their conquered kingdom. I stepped out of my truck and felt the weight of betrayal settle into my chest. My boots pressed into ground that should have felt familiar, but instead it felt foreign, as if the earth itself had turned its back on me. The sting wasn't just personal. It was deeper, sharper. This wasn't about losing property. This wasn't about money. It felt like the very soil I had risked my life to protect had been ripped away from me. Every time I carried a rifle into battle, I thought of home. Every time I pulled a comrade out of danger, I thought of the promise of peace waiting for me. And now that piece had been sold like it was nothing more than a bargaining chip in some neighborhood power play. I clenched my fists, my pulse pounding in my ears. Anger surged, but beneath it was something worse, violation. The land was sacred to me, woven into my bloodline, my identity. And now it had been desecrated by people who value profit and control over honor and sacrifice. As I walked closer, one of the board members noticed me. He was dressed in khakis and a button-up shirt, the kind of uniform for men who fought their battles in conference rooms. He looked at me with an expression that flickered between annoyance and condescension, as if I were some trespasser on his property. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone dripping with false politeness. I wanted to shout. I wanted to tell him this was mine, that every brick, every blade of grass under his polished shoes belonged to me. But I didn't. Years of training had taught me restraint. Instead, I just stared, letting silence carry the weight of what I felt. He smirked, dismissing me with a wave of his hand before turning back to his coffee. That moment seared into me like a brand. It wasn't just disrespect. It was mockery. These people thought they had beaten me, that I would just accept the loss and fade away. But they didn't understand who they were dealing with, because I wasn't just a man returning from war. I was a soldier trained to fight battles no one else dared to face. And if they thought I would surrender the one thing my father entrusted to me, they had another thing coming. That night, I sat in the empty shell of what used to be my father's workshop, staring at the ruins of the past. The wind whistled through broken beams, carrying with it memories of laughter, sweat, and hard work. I closed my eyes and made a promise, not just to myself, but to my father, to my family, to every comrade who never made it home. I would reclaim what was mine, and I wouldn't just take back the land. I would take down the empire they built on it. The HOA thought they had won a quiet victory, hidden behind paperwork and bureaucracy. They didn't realize that the man they stole from was the very same kind of man who doesn't give up, who doesn't break, who doesn't stop until justice is served. This wasn't just betrayal. This was war. And unlike them, I knew how to fight a war to the end. The morning after I returned, I drove into town with one mission on my mind: find the truth. I wasn't looking for a fight. Not yet. What I needed were answers, cold, hard facts that couldn't be denied, twisted, or buried. The place to find them was a county office, where the records sat stacked in dusty files and digital databases. Bureaucracy might move slowly, but it leaves a trail, and I was ready to follow it to the very end. Walking into that building, I felt the same sharp focus I had felt on patrols overseas. It wasn't combat, but it might as well have been. The stakes felt just as high. The polished tile floors echoed under my boots as I crossed the lobby, the hum of fluorescent lights above me buzzing like static in my ears. The smell of old paper and printer ink mixed with the faint aroma of stale coffee drifting from a corner desk. I gave my name to the clerk, explained I was there to review property records, and watched as her polite smile flickered with unease. It was subtle, barely a twitch, but I caught it. My instincts sharpened. Something was already off. Minutes later, I sat at a desk with a thick folder dropped in front of me. The clerk walked away quickly, almost too quickly, as if she didn't want to stick around to see what I was about to uncover. I opened the file, and the first page nearly stopped my heart. Notice of abandonment. Stamped across it was my name, my property address, and a claim that I had failed to respond to multiple letters. According to this document, I had relinquished all rights to the property, and the HOA had the authority to auction it. I frowned. Flipping to the back, there were signatures, mine, supposedly, scribbled in rush pen strokes. But they weren't mine, not even close. My real signature has a sharp angle on the A, a habit I picked up signing forms in the military. This one was smooth, rounded, almost lazy, a forgery, plain and simple. My blood ran cold, but I forced myself to breathe evenly. Rage wouldn't help me now. Precision would. I kept turning pages. The so-called auction notice was buried in a local classified section of a paper hardly anyone reads. The dates didn't line up. One deadline posted a week before the supposed notice even went public. It was sloppy but deliberate, a con job, executed by people who thought no one would check. I leaned closer, studying the stamps and seals. Some were smudged, inconsistent with official records. One page claimed to be notarized, but the notary's commission number was expired. My pulse quickened, but not from fear. From clarity. This wasn't just incompetence. This was organized fraud. The deeper I dug, the worse it got. There were fake, certified letters, allegedly sent to me at my address, each one stamped as undeliverable. Yet, I had mail forwarding through the military, and not a single one had ever reached me overseas. I knew because my commanding officer personally handled those logistics. Someone had lied. Someone had deliberately blocked communication. I flipped through timestamps, comparing dates to military deployment records I carried in my bag. Sure enough, every so-called failure to respond coincided with days I was halfway around the world dodging bullets. They counted on my absence. They exploited my service. I sat back in the chair, the weight of betrayal pressing down on me again. But this time it wasn't just anger, it was certainty. These people had built their theft on a house of lies, and I was holding the blueprint. I gathered every page, scanning it with my phone, labeling files with military precision. Document 1, forged signature. Document 2, expired notary. Document 3, invalid deadlines. Document 4, falsified mail. Each one a weapon in the war I was about to wage. My training had taught me to see patterns where others saw noise, to notice the detail in the shadows, the flaw in the armor. Here, the flaws weren't in camouflage or tactics. They were in ink, paper, and bureaucracy. And they were everywhere. The more I uncovered, the more I realized this was an accident. This was calculated. The HOA hadn't just made a mistake. They had conspired, orchestrated, and executed a fraud with the precision of a heist. They thought paperwork was their weapon. They didn't realize that paperwork was also their weakness. I remembered nights overseas, scanning intelligence reports by dim red lights, piecing together the enemy's moves from scraps of information. This felt the same. The documents in front of me weren't just evidence. They were enemy positions, weak points, vulnerabilities waiting to be exposed. By the time I left that office, my folder was thick, my phone full of scanned pages, my mind sharper than it had been in months. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the town in amber light. I stood on the steps of the county building, clutching the evidence to my chest. People walked by, unaware of the war that had just begun in the shadows of paperwork. To them, it was just another Tuesday evening. To me, it was the beginning of justice. For a moment, I closed my eyes and thought of my father, thought of the promise he made me swear to keep, thought of the soil that carried our history, now paved over by strangers who thought they could erase me with a few forged signatures. Not anymore. I had what I needed. Proof. Facts. Truth written in black ink, undeniable and damning. And I wasn't going to let it sit in a folder. No, this was the arsenal I needed to strike back. The HOA thought they had buried me under paperwork, but what they didn't realize was that they had armed me instead. And now, it was only a matter of time before I turned their own lives against them, piece by piece, page by page, until their entire house of cards collapsed. This wasn't just evidence. This was war intelligence, and I knew exactly how to use it. The HOA thought I was just one man, just another voice they could drown out with legal jargon and intimidation. They saw me as a returning soldier, weary from war, unprepared for the battlefield of paperwork and courtrooms. Easy to brush aside. They were wrong. What they hadn't counted on was the law itself standing beside me. Not just any law, but the Service Member Civil Relief Act, SCRA, a piece of legislation forged for moments exactly like this. It was designed to protect deployed soldiers from predatory schemes, from foreclosure sharks, from vultures circling while men and women were overseas defending the very freedoms those vultures abused. And in my case, it was a shield sharper than any sword. The more I read, the clearer it became, the HOA hadn't just broken rules. They had violated federal protections that courts treat with zero tolerance. My deployment, my orders, my status. They were ironclad evidence that the HOA had acted illegally. Still, I knew the battlefield had changed. Out there, I carried a rifle. Here, my weapon was knowledge. And just like in war, you don't fight alone. I reached out to the Judge Advocate General's JAG office. Within days, I had a team of military attorneys who had seen every dirty trick in the book. These weren't rookies. They were seasoned in defending service members against banks, landlords, and organizations that thought soldiers were easy prey. When they heard my story, their expressions hardened. They didn't see me as a case. They saw me as one of their own. For the first time since I set foot back home, I wasn't alone. We turned my folder of evidence into a weapon. Every page I had scanned, every timestamp I had logged, every forged signature I had spotted, it was all ammunition. The JAG team went to work like a strike force. They drafted filings, dissected every clause, and lined up every violation in black and white. The HOA had no idea what was coming. At first, they laughed. I could almost picture them in their boardroom, sipping coffee out of mugs that read, HOA Strong, dismissing me as a disgruntled veteran who didn't know how the system worked. They'd dealt with complaints before, brushed aside neighbors who challenged their authority, buried families in fines until they gave up. But I wasn't just a neighbor. I was a soldier. And now, I had the full weight of the U.S. military legal system standing behind me. The first subpoena hit their mailbox like a thunderclap, then another, and another. Suddenly, the smug grin started to falter. Their business as usual turned into frantic phone calls to lawyers. They tried to spin it, to argue it was all just procedure, just policy enforcement. But the documents told a different story, a story of deliberate fraud, forged signatures, false notices, and property theft while I was deployed. Every time their lawyers tried to push back, my team countered with precision. JAG attorneys are trained not just in law but in combat logic. They know how to anticipate, how to cut off escape routes, how to dismantle an opponent piece by piece. The HOA board members who once smirked from their porches now avoided eye contact when I drove through the neighborhood. They knew the tide was shifting. I'll never forget one moment in particular. I walked into the JAG office, uniform pressed, folder in hand, ready to go over the latest filings. One of the attorneys, a colonel with decades of service behind him, looked up from the stack of evidence and said, "Son, they don't stand a chance. Not against this." It wasn't flattery. It was certainty. We didn't just build a case. We built a fortress. Exhibits were lined up like artillery, each one hammering home a violation. Emails proving false communication. Certified letters that had never been delivered. Forged documents with handwriting so sloppy even a rookie analyst could see the fraud. And over all of it, the SCRA like a sledgehammer, making clear that their actions weren't just immoral, they were illegal at the federal level. The HOA's laughter turned into silence, silence into whispers, whispers into panic. I started noticing subtle changes. Board members who once strutted through the subdivision now kept their heads down. Cars that were always parked confidently in driveways now vanished when subpoenas were served. At night, the same people who mocked me now held hush meetings, lights burning late in houses they no longer had the right to feel secure in. Justice was closing in and they could feel it. Still, they tried one last desperate move. Their lawyers filed a motion to dismiss, claiming I had failed to act in a timely manner and that the sale was already final. It was a Hail Mary pass, thrown in desperation. We crushed it. The JAG team presented deployment orders, showing exactly where I was and why I couldn't have possibly responded. They cited case law where courts had overturned similar scams. They pointed out the expired notary stamps, the forged handwriting, the fabricated deadlines. It was a massacre, legal, clean, and devastating. And as I watched the HOA's defense unravel, I realized something important. This wasn't just about me anymore. This was about every soldier who would ever worry about their home while they were deployed. Every family that had feared losing what they had while their loved one fought overseas. This case was bigger than one property. It was a warning shot to every predatory group that thought service members were easy targets. By the time the dust settled, the HOA no longer looked confident. They looked like what they truly were, bullies exposed in the harsh light of truth. The subpoenas kept coming. Depositions were scheduled. Board members squirmed under questioning. Their empire, once built on arrogance and intimidation, was crumbling under the weight of their own fraud. And me, I stood taller with every passing day, because I knew that the law, the truth, and an army of defenders stood with me. The HOA thought I was just one man, but in reality I was never alone. And soon, the courtroom would prove it. The day of judgment felt heavier than any deployment briefing I'd ever stood through. The courthouse loomed ahead, tall stone columns carved against the morning sky, its doors polished from decades of people pushing through them. Some hopeful, some broken, all waiting for justice. As I walked up those steps, dressed in my pressed indoor service uniform, my boots clicked like the drumbeat of war. I wasn't carrying a rifle, but the weight of my evidence folder felt just as powerful. The courtroom was already packed when I arrived. Rows of polished wooden benches creaked under the weight of neighbors, reporters, curious onlookers, and more than a few people who had been burned by HOAs in their own lives. The air buzzed with whispers, each one hushed when the doors opened. This wasn't just another property dispute. This was a spectacle. On the other side of the aisle, the HOA's lawyers made their entrance. Expensive suits, silk ties, the kind of smug expressions only money can buy. They strutted like men who thought they'd already won, each step heavy with arrogance. Behind them sat the board members themselves, shifting nervously, their once confident smiles cracking around the edges. When the judge entered, the room rose. The sound of the gavel echoed like thunder against the walls, commanding silence. My heart pounded, but not with fear, with anticipation. I had lived through firefights, IEDs, nights where the darkness itself felt like an enemy. Compared to that, this was a battlefield I was ready for. The HOA opened first. Their lead lawyer spoke with a slick confidence, weaving words meant to paint me as careless, negligent, even reckless. According to them, I had abandoned the property, ignored notices, and left them no choice but to act. They spoke of policy enforcement and community stability, painting their theft as civic duty. Their words flowed like poison honey, sweet to the uninformed ear but venomous at the core. But the venom didn't last long. My attorneys, sharp, disciplined, and relentless, rose like a coordinated strike team. The lead JAG attorney, a colonel with steel in his voice, laid the first piece of evidence on the table, a forged signature. He held it up against my official records, comparing each stroke, each curve of the pen. It wasn't just off, it was laughably fake. The jury's heads tilted. The judge leaned forward. The HOA lawyer shifted in his chair. Then came the expired notary stamp. The colonel pointed to the dates, his voice slicing through the silence. This notary was no longer licensed when this document was signed. That makes this filing invalid. Not questionable, invalid. The judge's eyebrow arched. A murmur rippled through the gallery. Next came the so-called auction notice, published in a tiny classified, and no one could reasonably be expected to see. Worse, the timeline didn't match. The deadlines had been backdated, set before the notice even went to print. One by one, the pieces stacked like artillery fire. Certified letters that were never sent. Records doctored to make it look like I ignored them. Deployment orders showing I was overseas when they claimed I failed to respond. Each document, each exhibit, hit like another shell landing on the HOA's defenses. The HOA lawyers tried to object, tried to spin, but every attempt was smothered under the weight of evidence. They looked less like seasoned professionals and more like corner rats scrambling for a hole. I sat there, hands folded, jaw tight, watching them unravel. I didn't need to speak. The truth was speaking louder than I ever could. Finally, the colonel invoked the Service Member Civil Relief Act. His voice rang like a battle cry. Federal law prohibits any foreclosure, repossession, or property seizure against an active duty service member without a court order. Not only did this HOA fail to seek such an order, they actively falsified documents to bypass it. This is not a technical error. This is fraud. Silence. The kind of silence that feels like a hell breath before an explosion. The HOA lawyers had nothing left. Their smug confidence had evaporated, leaving only sweat glistening on their brows. The board members sat pale, fidgeting in their seats. Their empire of arrogance was crumbling in real time. The judge leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled, his gaze sharp as steel. He scanned the evidence laid out before him, page after damning page. Then, with a slow exhale, he raised the gavel. When it came down, it wasn't just with striking wood. It was thunder rolling through the room. This court finds the sale of the plaintiff's property void. The judge declared, his voice echoing like a verdict from the heavens. Furthermore, it recognizes that the subdivision built upon said property is constructed on illegally acquired land. Full repossession is hereby granted the plaintiff. The words hung in the air like a lightning strike. For a moment, no one moved. Then the gallery erupted, gasps, whispers, even a few claps muffled by the bailiff's stern glare. The HOA board members looked as if the floor had been ripped from beneath them. One buried his face in his hands. Another muttered under his breath. Their lawyers shuffled papers with trembling hands, already calculating how much their clients had just lost. As for me, I sat still, letting the words sink in. Full repossession. Not just my land, but every inch of concrete, every cul-de-sac, every neatly trimmed lawn and cookie-cutter house. The entire empire they thought they controlled now legally belonged to me. It was more than victory. It was justice. When I stood, my uniform catching the light from the high windows, I felt the weight of every sacrifice I had made overseas, every moment of doubt and rage since I returned, lift off my shoulders. I hadn't just fought for myself. I had fought for something bigger, for the principle that soldiers shouldn't have to defend their homes from the very people they swore to protect. As I walked out of that courtroom, the sun outside felt brighter, the air cleaner. Reporters swarmed, neighbors stared, and whispers followed me down the steps. But I didn't stop. I didn't need applause. I already had what I came for. Justice. And for the first time since I stepped off that plane from deployment, I felt whole again. The final act unfolded like a movie, except this time, I wasn't watching. I was standing in the center of it. It was early morning when the convoy arrived. A line of government-issued vehicles rolled down the subdivision streets, tires crunching over pristine asphalt that had been poured on top of my land. U.S. Marshals stepped out first, their uniforms crisp, their presence commanding instant authority. Each one carried a thick stack of official documents, eviction notices, stamped and sealed, the kind of paperwork that could topple kings. Behind them came the military legal officers. They weren't carrying weapons, but their calm, steady presence was every bit as powerful. These were the men and women who had stood beside me in the courtroom, who had turned my evidence into a fortress. And now, they were here in person, to make sure justice was carried out without question. I stood just behind them, my own uniform pressed, boots planted firmly on the soil that had always been mine. It felt surreal, like reclaiming a battlefield after the dust of war had settled. Except here, the enemy wasn't armed soldiers. It was an HOA board whose arrogance had blinded them into thinking they could steal from a soldier and get away with it. The marshals began knocking on doors, their voices carrying across the quiet streets. Federal eviction notice. You have 24 hours to vacate. Some doors slammed shut in panic. Others creaked open slowly, revealing wide-eyed board members whose bravado had evaporated. The same people who once lorded over the neighborhood with fines and threats now shuffled forward with pale faces and trembling hands. One board member, the very same man who once smirked at me and waved me off like a trespasser, was escorted down his own driveway. He tried to argue at first, his voice rising, insisted it was all a misunderstanding. But the marshal held up the notice, calm and unwavering. Court order. Full repossession. The man's words died in his throat. For the first time, he looked small. Neighbors peeked through curtains, their whispers buzzing like electricity. Some were shocked, others quietly delighted. For years, they lived under the HOA's thumb, paying fines for the color of their shutters, for grass an inch too high, for mailboxes not painted a proved shade of beige. Now, they watched the empire collapse in real time. I caught the eye of one elderly couple standing at the edge of their yard. The husband gave me the smallest of nods, a gesture that said what words couldn't. Gratitude, respect, relief. As the marshals worked, I walked the perimeter of the subdivision. Each step felt heavier with memory. Here was where my father's workshop once stood, replaced by a cul-de-sac. There, the old oak tree where I used to sit as a kid, now buried under concrete. They had tried to erase my history with bulldozers and blueprints. But now, that history was mine again. The HOA board members were gathered near the entrance by midday, their faces a collage of defeat. Some were red with anger, others pale with fear. They muttered to each other, occasionally glancing at me with a mixture of contempt and something else, something that looked an awful lot like regret. The head marshal, a broad-shouldered man with a voice like gravel, turned to me and asked, "Would you like to do the honors?" I took the stack of final notices from his hand. The papers were thick, the weight of justice tangible between my fingers. One by one, I handed them out to the board members. Some refused to meet my eyes. Others glared, but their glares held no power anymore. Each page they took was a reminder that their reign was over. When the last notice was delivered, I stepped back and let out a slow breath. For months, I had carried anger like a weapon, sharp and burning. Now, standing on my soil with the empire of lies collapsing around me, that anger finally gave way to something else. Peace. Neighbors began stepping outside, more boldly now, their curiosity outweighing their fear. A few clapped softly. Others shook their heads in disbelief. Children pointed at the marshals, asking their parents questions. The subdivision that once pulsed with the HOA's control now buzzed with the raw, unfiltered energy of freedom. I turned toward the board members one last time. They stood in a cluster, eviction papers in hand, their arrogance stripped bare. I spoke clearly, my voice steady and carrying across the street. This land was mine before you built on it. It will be mine long after you're gone. You thought you could take it because I was serving overseas. You were wrong. When you steal from a soldier, you don't just pick a fight with a man. You declare war on an army. And today you lost. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the wind seemed to pause. Then the marshals began their final sweep, taping notices to doors, logging every detail with precision. The subdivision, once a symbol of HOA dominance, now stood as a monument to their downfall. As the sun dipped lower, casting long golden shadows across the pavement, I walked back to the edge of the land. My boots sank slightly into the soil near what remained of my father's workshop foundation. I knelt, running my hand across the ground, feeling the earth between my fingers. It was rough, uneven, scarred, but it was real, and it was mine. Justice had been served. The empire they built on lies had crumbled under its weight, and I was left standing, not just as a soldier, but as a son, a landowner, a man who had fought for what was right and won. That day, the HOA learned a truth they would never forget. When you steal from a soldier, you don't just face one man. You face everyone who stands with him. And together, we are unstoppable.